When my partner, Emma, and I moved into our new home last spring, we thought we'd finally found our little slice of peace. It's one of those cookie-cutter suburban neighborhoods. Identical houses, manicured lawns, and quiet streets where you occasionally see kids riding bikes. The house next to ours was a little different, though. The paint was peeling, the yard was overgrown, and the curtains were always drawn. Our neighbor, an old man named Mr. Holloway, lived there alone. We only saw him a handful of times, shuffling to his mailbox or standing at his window, staring blankly outside. We tried introducing ourselves once, but he barely grunted in response and shut his door without a word. It was odd, but we shrugged it off. Some people just prefer to keep to themselves. About 2 weeks after we moved in, strange things started happening. It began with faint sounds late at night, knocking, scraping, and what almost sounded like something heavy being dragged across a floor. The noises were muffled, coming from the direction of the shared basement wall that divided our home from Mr. Holloway's. At first, we rationalized it. Maybe he was moving furniture around or had some kind of hobby. But the sounds continued, always at night, always just faint enough to make us second-guess if we'd actually heard them. Then came the smell. It crept into our basement slowly, a sour, metallic odor mixed with something rotten. We thought maybe an animal had died in the walls. But as the days passed, it got worse, thicker, more nauseating. That's when Emma said, "We need to figure out what's going on over there." We decided to take a closer look in our basement. Armed with a flashlight and wearing scarves over our noses to dull the smell, Emma and I inspected every corner. The odor was strongest near the shared wall, where we noticed something strange. A faint outline of what looked like a doorway or a hatch on Mr. Holloway's side. The drywall on our side was slightly discolored, and when I pressed my hand against it, it felt hollow. That's when the knocking started again. 3 slow, deliberate thuds, just inches away from where my hand was resting. Emma jumped back, and I swear I felt my stomach drop. We bolted upstairs without saying a word. The next day, we decided we couldn't ignore it anymore. Emma called the non-emergency police line and explained the smell and the noises. An officer showed up later that afternoon, a guy in his early 40s who looked more annoyed than concerned. He went next door to talk to Mr. Holloway while we waited by our window watching. But after knocking several times, the officer turned back to us and said, "No answer. If you really think something's wrong, you'll need more than a bad smell to get a warrant." And just like that, he left. That night, the knocking returned, louder this time. And it wasn't just knocking. It was followed by a faint, muffled voice. A woman's voice. Neither of us slept that night. Every time the house fell quiet, the knocking would start again. 3 slow, heavy thuds, always followed by that faint voice. It was impossible to make out what she was saying, but the tone was unmistakable. Desperation. By dawn, Emma and I had made a plan. If the police wouldn't help, we'd try to see what was behind that wall ourselves. I borrowed a hammer from the garage, and we went down to the basement. Emma stayed back near the stairs while I pressed my ear against the wall, listening. The smell was unbearable now, like spoiled meat and rusted metal. With one hard swing, I cracked open a section of the drywall. Dust and bits of plaster fell to the floor, and through the hole I saw it. A narrow, pitch-black passageway leading into Mr. Holloway's side of the basement. The air that escaped from that gap made me gag, and I swear I could feel it clinging to my skin. Emma whispered, "Do you see anything?" But before I could answer, we both froze. From somewhere deep in that darkness came a sound. A wet, gurgling inhale, followed by a dragging noise, as if something heavy was being pulled across concrete. Without thinking, I dropped the hammer and stumbled backward. Emma was already halfway up the stairs, screaming for me to follow. We called the police again, this time refusing to let them brush us off. This time, the police took us more seriously. Maybe it was the panic in Emma's voice, or the way I couldn't stop shaking when I described what we heard. 2 officers arrived about 30 minutes later, along with a detective and a couple more squad cars. They told us to stay outside while they entered Mr. Holloway's property. From our porch, we could see the officers banging on his front door, announcing themselves, and finally forcing their way inside when no one answered. Minutes passed like hours. Then, one of the officers came out, pale and visibly shaken, calling for backup on his radio. When the crime scene van pulled up, I realized whatever they'd found wasn't just bad. It was something horrific. They wouldn't let us back inside our house or anywhere near Mr. Holloway's property. We spent hours sitting in the back of an officer's car, watching as more investigators arrived, some wearing hazmat suits. Eventually, one of the officers came over and told us what they'd found, or at least part of it. Behind that sealed-off section in the basement, they'd uncovered a hidden room. There were chains bolted into the concrete floor, a stained mattress, and several buckets filled with, well, I'll let you fill in the blanks. But the worst part was the freezer. A large industrial freezer pushed against the far wall, padlocked shut. We didn't get to see inside the freezer, and honestly, I'm glad we didn't. The officers didn't tell us much, but their faces said enough. Emma was in tears, clutching my arm so tightly I thought she might bruise it. Mr. Holloway wasn't in the house, and despite hours of searching, they couldn't find him anywhere. The detective told us that the freezer contained remains, plural, multiple people. They didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. Apparently, the voice we heard, the faint knocking, it wasn't just in our heads. There had been someone in there, someone alive, trying to get out. But by the time the police arrived, it was too late. The next few days were a blur. Police cars, news vans, neighbors whispering over fences. Emma and I stayed in a hotel because there was no way we could sleep in that house knowing what had been just on the other side of our basement wall. They never found Mr. Holloway. It's like he disappeared into thin air. The official story they gave to the media was vague. Something about evidence of long-term unlawful confinement and ongoing investigation. But Emma and I know the truth. We heard the knocking. We heard the voice. Someone was there and someone was suffering. After about a month, the investigation seemed to lose steam. The police eventually stopped showing up at the house next door, and the media moved on to the next big story. The authorities boarded up Mr. Holloway's basement, and the house was officially marked as uninhabitable. But even with all that behind us, Emma and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't really over. We decided to sell our house. The idea of stepping into that basement again, of hearing those sounds in the middle of the night, was just impossible. On our last night in the house, I went down to the basement one final time. Emma stayed upstairs. She couldn't bear to go back down there. I stood near the shared wall, staring at the patched-up hole where we'd first discovered the passage. The smell was gone, but the memory of it lingered in my throat. And then, in that unbearable silence, I heard it. 3 faint knocks, slow, deliberate, coming from the same spot on the wall. I didn't stay to listen for more. I ran upstairs, grabbed Emma, and we left without looking back. We handed over the keys to a real estate agent the next morning and drove away without a second glance at that house. Emma and I don't talk about it much anymore, not because we've forgotten, but because we can't. Every now and then, I'll hear a noise in the middle of the night, a faint knock, a dragging sound, and my stomach twists into knots. Logically, I know it's probably just the house settling or something outside, but my mind always goes back to that basement, to that smell, to that voice. Mr. Holloway was never found. No family ever came looking for him. No friends reported him missing. It's like he was a ghost long before we ever moved in. The house still sits empty to this day, the windows dark and the lawn overgrown. Sometimes I think about the people in that freezer, the lives that ended in that horrible room, and I wonder if anyone else ever heard them knocking. If anyone else ignored the smell or dismissed the sounds in the night. And then I wonder if Mr. Holloway is still out there somewhere, watching another house, another couple, waiting for the next knock. When I rented the storage unit, I wasn't expecting much. Just a cold, dim space to stash my stuff during the semester break. It was cheap, out on the edge of town near some abandoned warehouses, and honestly, it felt sketchy from the start. The guy who managed the place, some chain-smoking middle-aged guy named Rick, barely looked up from his phone when I signed the papers. "Just don't lose your key," he grumbled, sliding the contract across the counter. "My unit, number 209, was tucked far into the maze of identical metal doors and flickering fluorescent lights. First, it was fine. I'd swing by on weekends, drop off boxes, maybe grab a few things I'd forgotten. But then I started noticing stuff. Started small. The first thing I noticed was my padlock. It wasn't where I usually left it after locking up. I have this habit of turning it so the numbers face outward, but one night it was twisted sideways. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I'd just been careless last time. But then I started seeing footprints. Dust covered most of the concrete floor in the corridor near my unit, and I could swear I saw fresh prints leading toward Unit 210, the one right next to mine. The weird thing, that unit was supposed to be empty. I remembered asking Rick about neighboring units when I signed the lease, and he specifically said 210 had been vacant for months. The next time I visited the storage unit, I decided to stay longer and pay closer attention. It was late, probably close to midnight, and the place was dead silent except for the occasional hum of the overhead lights. I kept glancing at the door to Unit 210, half expecting it to swing open while I wasn't looking. As I moved a few boxes around, I heard it, a faint scratching sound. It was soft, deliberate, and definitely coming from the direction of 210. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear more. But then it stopped, like whoever or whatever was making the noise realized I was listening. The next day, I confronted Rick. He barely looked up from his phone as I explained what I'd seen and heard. "No one's in 210, he said flatly, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "It's been empty for months. Probably just rats or something." I didn't buy it. Rats don't twist padlocks or leave footprints in dust. When I pressed him, Rick just shrugged and told me if it bothered me so much, I could cancel my lease. But I couldn't afford to move my stuff somewhere else, so I let it drop. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in that unit. Someone who knew when I was there. Couldn't let it go. That night, I drove back to the storage facility, determined to get some answers. I parked a little further away from the entrance, keeping my headlights off as I approached. The place felt different at night, like it was holding its breath. I unlocked my unit as quietly as I could and stepped inside, leaving the door cracked just enough to peek out. My plan was simple: wait and watch. I sat on a plastic crate, phone in hand, staring at the door to Unit 210. For a long time, nothing happened. But then, just past 1 a.m., I heard it again, the scratching. This time it was louder, more frantic, like nails dragging against metal. I crept toward the door of Unit 210, every step making my heartbeat slam against my ribs. The padlock on the door was there, but something felt off. It looked hastily closed, like someone had locked it in a hurry. My hand was shaking as I reached out and tugged on it. To my surprise, the padlock slipped open. It hadn't been locked properly. With a deep breath, I pulled the door up just enough to see inside. What I saw made my stomach drop. A small camping chair sat in the middle of the space, surrounded by food wrappers, empty water bottles, and piles of filthy blankets. But the worst part? Against the back wall, there was a stack of photos of me, walking into the unit, unloading boxes, looking at my phone. Someone had been watching me. My chest felt tight, and my vision blurred for a moment as I tried to process what I was seeing. The photos weren't just random snapshots. They were taken from different angles, through the gaps in my unit's door, and even from outside the facility. Some of them were close-ups of my face while I was bent over boxes, completely unaware. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been watching me for weeks, maybe months. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over an empty can on the floor. That's when I noticed something else. A small notebook tucked under the camping chair. I grabbed it with trembling hands and flipped it open. Inside were messy, scribbled notes. "She comes every Friday. Alone. Leaves in under 30 minutes." Another entry read, "She didn't see me today. Almost got caught." The most recent entry was dated just 2 days earlier. "She's starting to notice. Might need to move soon." My stomach turned, and I felt bile rise in my throat. Whoever this was, they were still watching me. And worse, they knew I was catching on. I didn't wait around to find out if they were nearby. I bolted out of Unit 210, slammed the door shut, and fumbled to lock it behind me. I sprinted back to my car, practically throwing myself into the driver's seat and locking the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone running after me or standing in the shadows. I didn't stop until I was parked in front of my apartment building, heart racing and head spinning. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see were those photos. My face, my movements, my routine, captured and cataloged by someone hiding just feet away from me. The next morning, I went straight back to the storage facility, this time with the police. Rick was there, his usual bored expression replaced with genuine concern, or fear, maybe. The officers unlocked Unit 210 and stepped inside while I stood back, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. The chair, the blankets, the wrappers, they were all still there. But the photos, the notebook, gone. Every trace of whoever had been living there had vanished overnight. One of the officers sighed and muttered something about squatters, but I could tell they didn't fully believe that either. Rick insisted he'd had no idea anyone was in there, and honestly, I couldn't tell if he was lying or just incompetent. The police didn't have much to say after that. They took a report, told me they'd keep an eye on the place, and that was it. No follow-up, no investigation, nothing. I stood there in the cold corridor of the storage facility, staring at Unit 210 as if it might somehow give me answers. But it didn't. Rick offered to let me break my lease without penalties, and I didn't hesitate. I spent the rest of the day hauling my stuff out of there, feeling exposed and vulnerable every time I turned my back on that darkened unit next door. That night, after everything was packed into my tiny apartment, I sat on my couch staring at the pile of boxes. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. Every creak of the floor, every shadow cast by headlights outside my window, it all felt sinister. Around midnight, I got a text from an unknown number. 4 words. "Why did you leave?" My heart dropped into my stomach. I blocked the number immediately, but I couldn't stop shaking. Whoever had been in that unit, they still had my number, my schedule, my face burned into their mind. And worst of all, I had no idea where they were now. I barely slept after that text. Every noise outside my window felt amplified. Every creak of my apartment floorboards felt like a footstep. I kept checking the locks on my doors and windows, pacing from room to room with my phone clutched in my hand. Days passed without another message, but the paranoia never faded. I changed my phone number, swapped my usual routines, and stopped going anywhere alone. Eventually, things started to feel normal again, or at least as normal as they could after something like that. But one day, about a month later, I was walking back to my car after a late class when I noticed something. On the windshield was a small piece of paper tucked under the wiper blade. My stomach knotted as I unfolded it. In the same messy handwriting from the notebook, it read, "I found you." My knees nearly buckled right there in the parking lot. I looked around, scanning every shadow, every parked car, every figure in the distance. But there was no one, just silence and the faint buzz of a nearby street lamp. I drove home shaking so hard I could barely keep my hands on the wheel. That night, I barricaded myself in my apartment. I dragged my couch in front of the door, closed every curtain, and sat on the floor with my phone clutched tightly in my hand. I considered calling the police again, but what would I even say? Hey, someone left a creepy note on my car, and I think it's connected to a squatter in an abandoned storage unit from weeks ago. They'd probably just tell me to stay alert and lock my doors. But as the hours crawled by, my exhaustion finally caught up with me, and at some point, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was 3:17 a.m. A single notification lit up the screen, an image sent from an unknown number. My breath caught in my throat as I opened it. It was a photo of me, asleep, on my living room floor. The timestamp on the photo, 2 minutes earlier. My head snapped up, eyes darting around the darkened room. But there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just me and the cold realization that someone had been in my apartment. Maybe they were still there. I don't remember much after that. I think I screamed, maybe called the police, but everything felt like a blur. When my grandmother passed away, I inherited her old house. A creaky, two-story Victorian tucked away at the edge of a sleepy town. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, and even then, the place always gave me the creeps. But it was mine now, and despite the peeling wallpaper and drafty windows, I decided to move in while I figured out what to do with it. The first few days were uneventful, just me dusting off old furniture and tossing out decades of junk. But the attic was different. Felt heavy up there, like the air itself was thicker. It was on my third day in the house that I noticed it. A tiny locked door in the attic, barely 2 feet high and hidden behind stacks of old trunks. I swear I'd never seen it before, and I spent nearly an hour trying to pry it open with whatever tools I could find. No luck. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it for the first time. Faint scratching sounds, like nails on wood, coming from directly above me. I told myself it was just mice, or the house settling. But then came the whispering, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to bleed through the attic floorboards. The next few nights were worse. The scratching became more frantic, and the whispers grew clearer, though I could never quite make out the words. Once, I could have sworn I heard faint coughing, like someone trying to stifle the sound. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the floorboards sent my heart racing, and I found myself staring at the attic door from my bed, wondering what was behind it. On the 5th night, I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a crowbar and a flashlight, I climbed back into the attic. The air up there was freezing, and the light caught dust particles hanging thick in the air like snowflakes. It took me nearly 20 minutes, but eventually, I pried the small door open. The wood splintered, and the padlock snapped, landing somewhere in the darkness. When I pulled the door wide, the flashlight beam illuminated a narrow, cramped space. A hidden room, barely tall enough for someone to crouch inside. There was an old, threadbare blanket laid out on the floor, a pile of empty food cans in the corner, and a small lantern that had long since burned out. But what stopped me cold was what hung on the wall. Photographs. Recent photographs. Of me, sitting at my desk, cooking in the kitchen, even sleeping in my bed. My breath caught in my throat as I realized every single one was taken from somewhere inside the house. My knees felt weak, and I had to steady myself against the wooden frame of the tiny door. The photos weren't just casual snapshots, they were calculated, deliberate. Each one captured me at my most vulnerable. Brushing my hair in the bathroom, watching TV in the living room, sleeping with my mouth slightly open. Whoever took these had been watching me for days, maybe weeks. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I scanned the rest of the cramped space. There was something else tucked into the corner, a small, dog-eared notebook. I flipped it open, and my stomach turned. The handwriting was frantic, uneven, and filled with disjointed thoughts. She doesn't know I'm here. She looks so peaceful when she sleeps. I think she heard me coughing last night. I have to be more careful. The last entry was dated just 2 days ago. I think she's getting closer. I'll have to leave soon. My breath hitched. Leave? Go where? Were they still here now, watching me from some other shadowy corner of the house? I slammed the notebook shut and bolted down the attic stairs, nearly tripping in my haste. My only thought was to get out of that house, to put as much distance between me and whatever or whoever had been living just feet above me. I didn't stop running until I was outside, standing barefoot on the cold grass, clutching the notebook in one hand and my phone in the other. My chest was heaving, my breath clouding in the chilly night air. I called the police right then and there, stammering through an explanation about the hidden room, the photos, and the entries in the notebook. They arrived about 20 minutes later, 2 officers with tired eyes and skeptical expressions. They followed me back into the house, their flashlights sweeping over every corner as we climbed into the attic. But when we opened the little door again, the room was empty. The blanket, the cans, the lantern, all gone. Even the photos had disappeared from the walls. The officers exchanged a glance, one of them sighing heavily as he muttered something about squatters and teenagers pulling pranks. They took the notebook as evidence and told me they'd file a report, but I could tell they didn't believe me, not really. Before leaving, one of them suggested I change the locks and maybe install some cameras. I nodded numbly as they walked out the front door, leaving me alone in that house again. Couldn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak of the floor, every distant gust of wind felt like proof that someone was still there, hiding just out of sight. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed a small bag with essentials, locked the front door behind me, and drove straight to a friend's house across town. I told her everything, the attic, the photos, the notebook. She tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just some drifter who had moved on after realizing they'd been caught. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The police never followed up. Weeks passed, and eventually, I worked up the courage to return to the house during daylight hours to gather the rest of my things. Everything seemed normal, too normal, as if the house itself had forgotten the fear it once held. But as I carried the last box to my car, I noticed something tucked under the doormat. It was a photograph, a fresh one. In it, I was standing at the attic door, flashlight in hand, staring into the hidden room. Scrawled across the bottom in that same frantic handwriting were the words, "I told you I'd leave, but I can always come back." I sold the house shortly after. I never went back, never checked the attic again. But every now and then, in the dead of night, I swear I hear faint scratching. And I wonder if someone somewhere is still watching.